We are live, I think. Are we live? I hope so. I need to check. Are we live? I have no idea. Yes, we are. I think we are. So I need to turn the volume down on my phone. Okay, we are live. Hello. There's nobody watching yet. Hopefully people will join the chat sooner rather than later. So what I'll do is I will go to share. I always forget what to do here. Share screen. Allow share screen. Chrome tab. Why do I always forget this? Share. Right, there we are. So, has it shared? And it has shared. Okay. So, this is what I wouldn't necessarily call the definitive 90s ranking of horror films by any stretch of the imagination. There are plenty of other films that you need to go and check out, but these are kind of like the ones that I regard as, you know, a combination of mainstream and some lesser known cuts. But I think these are the ones that made up my sort of 90s and early noughties, because obviously some of these films I saw like as a in my 20s, 30s even. But we're gonna crack on right on with Event Horizon from 1997. Now this is arguably the greatest sci-fi horror film of the 90s. I don't think there's anything that comes close to it. You could argue that it's a horror film outright. Obviously it's more. It's certainly a sci-fi film, a sci-fi action film, but the horror elements to it are so strong you can't rule it out. And especially if this had been released in the 80s, I would have maybe made a separate, video of 80s sci-fi movies. But because the 90s was so bereft of like horror, that I'm going to have to include it, because, as I say, the 90s was such a bad decade for horror. I did some research today, and like literally, I was trying to remember some of the old deep cuts that I'd maybe forgotten about, because I had like a little list of films I wanted to include, but I needed to go back and remind myself of like some of these 90s movies that I'd forgotten about. And I mean, seriously, there's just a lot of the same films appear on every website list. If you go to the 80s, there's just so much there that is. There's just so much material, but you go to the 90s and it's the same old films keep popping up, and it's like it just goes to show you how lacking the 90s was in like good. And I'm talking about horror, just horror in general. I'm not talking about slasher films. Slasher films in the 90s, up until like Scream, were just non-existent, more or less, apart from obviously Halloween and Freddy, and they were on the way out. But yeah, in terms of just horror in general, there was just such little to go on. And Event Horizon it's definitely, I'm starting off strong, because this is definitely S tier. This is an absolutely incredible movie. It's definitely S tier. Staying on the sci-fi thing, Alien 3, not really my cup of tea. I love Aliens, the sequel, is like one of the greatest sci-fi. Well, it's arguably, if you include Terminator and Terminator 2 in terms of sci-fi action, then I'd have to say it probably become just below them two films. But it's just, Aliens and Alien are fantastic movies. Alien 3, not really my thing. It's quite slow paced. One alien in the whole film, which harkens back to the original, but it's not a patch on the original film. You don't really care about the characters. You obviously care about Ripley, but the side cast, they're not nice people. They are criminals, and they are like sons of bitches. You don't really give a shit about them. Whereas in the original film, you really do like the dynamic they have together as a crew, and you just don't get that with Alien 3. So I think this is going to have to go B tier. It's not. I'm not a massive fan of Alien 3, to be honest with you. Now, Misery, another Stephen. Well, this is the first of quite a few Stephen King adaptations. Not the biggest fan of Stephen King adaptations that were released in the 90s. I love it, the 1990 TV movie, and I love The Shining, the earlier stuff. I'm a massive fan of, but Misery, I do like the film, but it's not, to me. It's not up there with like his best adaptations. And I've never read the book, so I honestly can't say about like what it is in it as a solid adaptation to the original source. But I think but it's still not. It's not a bad film. It got great acting, and James Caan and Kathy Bates are fantastic actors. But it's going to go to B. It's going to be B tier again, but it's going to go behind Alien 3, I think. Now this always happens every week. There's a film I cannot recognise, and I think that's one of them. Let me just click on it. Yeah, I'm not sure what film that is. I want to go back to that. So, In the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter, mid-90s John Carpenter, not the best era for John Carpenter, to be fair. We all know his golden period was like the late 70s, early 80s. Some people really like this film. I'm not a massive fan of this film. I think this film is slightly overrated in terms of the people who I speak to, they kind of really like this film. I'm not saying it's overrated in general, but I'm not a massive fan of this film. I do think it's a bit long-winded, and I think John Carpenter was definitely sort of like his powers were waning at this point. And for me, this is actually going to be C tier. I'm just not a fan of this film. Now, The Sixth Sense. You could argue that this isn't a horror film. It's probably not a horror film, but as I say, the 90s were so short on like genuine like horror films that it would be unfair for me not to include this, because this is whatever your thoughts on M. Night Shyamalan, how his career went, and maybe even this film in general. I personally think this film is a fantastic thriller. I don't think it's a horror film, but regarding what we've got to work with in terms of 90s movies, I thought I had to include it. It's a great cinema going experience, and I saw this film, first week, so I had no inclination as to what the spoiler was. And bear in mind, this was the early days of the internet, so it wasn't as prevalent, getting spoiled by films. So when you get this sort of big reveal, it was a big surprise to me. I'm a bit stupid. I never saw it coming, but this is definitely A tier for me. I think this is a really, really solid film. M. Night Shyamalan, I don't think has he ever topped it? Maybe with Unbreakable. I don't think he's ever topped it with anything since. Now onto the Blair Witch Project, arguably the film that really sort of broke found film movies. I mean, The Last Broadcast came out in '98, which is a film that not many people know of, and arguably that did, do the whole found footage thing a year earlier. Obviously, we all know that Um, Cannibal Holocaust did it in 20 years before that, but that didn't influence anything in terms of like new films. Neither did Last Broadcast. The Blair Witch Project did. When that dropped, that was like the new big thing. Found footage films, which was like the big, that they just took off, all because of Blair Witch Project. Nothing to do with Last Broadcast. So you can't dispute its importance, and it is a really, really solid film. It's not for me. It's not S tier. It's definitely A tier though. I definitely would put it in the A tier because I saw the film twice in the cinema, and even the second time, it still packed the punch. You can't deny the importance of this film, and it does resonate, and so I would put it behind Sixth Sense, but definitely A tier. Next up is Sleepy Hollow, Johnny Depp, 1999. This movie is not really the sort of thing I usually go for, but it is. It's quite interesting. It's very typical of Tim Burton. It's very dark. It's kind of got very dark comedy and quite bleak, but it has got a sense of humour. But it's not really my sort of thing. But I do like that Tim Burton. I'm not a big fan of Tim Burton per se, but it's going to be B tier for me. It's going to be behind Misery. It's not. It's not like. I mean, anything Tim Burton does is not really my cup of tea, to be honest. Yeah, this is probably like the closest he's come to like really resonating with me. But I would put him there. Timmy, what's up, man? Good to see you in the chat. How's it going, man? Any suggestions? If let me know what would you put some of these films that I've ranked. Next up is another Stephen King movie, The Dark Half from 1993. This is during Stephen King's sort of, it's like iffy period where he wasn't really, well, I'm not a big horror expert in terms of books. I'm certainly not a massive Stephen King fan in terms of like, I've read It, I've read The Shining, and that's about it. But I am kind of vaguely aware that during the sort of like early 90s, late 80s, he probably wasn't producing his best stuff. And The Dark Half, I think, was part of that time period. And they put out this film in 93, and I went to the cinema to see this. And yeah, it was pretty underwhelming. It certainly wasn't anything like the level of, even the TV movie It, which has got its detractors, but a lot of people love that film or TV miniseries. But this for me it's definitely DC. This was poor in my opinion. Next up, Ringu, 1998. This was kind of like the birth of the J horror, not in terms of like obviously over in Japan and Korea, they probably had this stuff for years, but in terms of like making an impact on the West, I think Ringu was the one that really kicked the doors down, and it's a solid film. I'm not sure it quite deserves the adulation it gets because I do think it is slightly flawed. I actually think there are elements of the remake which make for a stronger film, but that was a 2000s movie, so I can't include that. But Dark Half with Needful Things in the books, I never knew that. As I say, I'm not a big fan, Tim, of the Stephen King novels. I know the basics. For me, it's like, it's the really, really obvious ones, like The Shining I've read, It I've read, and obviously, like, some of like the 80s stuff I'm really well versed with, but it's later stuff I'm not really sort of like up to date with. I know he had that car. When did he have the car crash? Because a lot of people say that after the car crash he had, his writing really sort of took a downturn, but I'm not sure when that was. But anyway, Ringu, yeah. So Ringu for me would be B tier. I do think it's a really, really, it's an important film in terms of like American cinema, even though it's obviously a Japanese or a Korean film. I think it's Japanese, but I think it had such a big influence on American film. But I'd definitely put it. I think I'd put it ahead of Misery, but behind Alien 3, if that works. There we go. Next up, I keep doing this. I keep downloading films and forgetting what they're called. So I can't remember what that one is. So we'll bypass that for now. We'll go to 7. 7 again is it's not really a horror film. I'd describe it as a psychological thriller, but you know, if this film had been released in the 80s, I wouldn't have included it in this list. But as I said, the 90s was so short of like decent horror films that you know you end up having to put stuff in them, but you wouldn't really probably include in any other decade. But literally, if you go on Wikipedia and just like type in 90s horror films, it'll give you a breakdown of like what came out that year, and there's just there's so slim pickings. It's incredible. But I mean, obviously, I'm not like knocking Seven. Seven's is a solid film. It's not my cup of tea. I did go and see it on the cinema. You know, you can't complain about the acting or the film. You know, stylistically, it's very good, but for me, it's a little bit too. That's maybe too dark because obviously what do you want from it, like a psychological horror, but it never lets up with the rain and the cinematography. It's very grim looking. It's not really my thing, but you know I can't knock it for what it is. But I'd have to go B tier, I'm afraid, and I'd probably put it in between Ringo and Misery, to be honest with you. So there we go. Next up is sticking a very similar subject matter, Silence of the Lambs again. Psychological thriller, horror, you know, early to mid 90s, you know, Hollywood had decided they didn't want anything to do with, you know, the sort of slasher movie, you know, far out, you know, crazy serial killer type, mask wearing, you know, killers, and they wanted to go something far more realistic, and you know, this is what they went with. And Silence of the Lambs is a product of that in 1991. Very, very sort of muted colours, very, very quite dark, very funny, more like based in reality. But go back and watch Silence of the Lambs. Go back and watch those opening credits. They are so dated, so early 90s, and it looks, you know, for this era of like early 90s and like sort of looking down to nose almost at the 80s, and you look back at some of these early 90s films at these opening credits, and they look so dated. They look like more dated than the 80s almost. It's just crazy. But you know, you can't. Sean, I had to mention Sean because I was hoping you were subscribed to my channel because you're always in the chat on Hayden's channel and Jay's and that, and I'm always in the chat, and I was like, I was hoping you were subscribed to me. So nice to see you, Sean. If you've got any, you know, suggestions as to what if I've fucked up in any of this, let me know. I think I'm pretty on point so far, but so yeah, Silence of the Lambs for me, it's going to be A tier, but it's going behind Blair Witch Project. It is a great film. It's better, definitely better than 7, that's for sure. Oof, now we've got Jason Goes to Hell. Jesus. So this was like the death throes of the early 90s. 1993 was possibly the worst year ever for horror films. Seriously, go Google horror films in 1993. There is nothing. There's just nothing there. Jason Goes to Hell is like, if that's like one of the highlights, that's a bad, you know, barometer of how bad things were. And Jason Goes to Hell, in my opinion, is the worst of the It's not a Friday the 13th film. It's a Jason Voorhees film. Friday the 13th ended in 1989. It died in 1989. Anything after 1989 is not a Friday the 13th movie. I'll even include the remake in that. For me, Friday the 13th was born in 1980 and died in 1989. It's the perfect 80s franchise. Anything after that, it's not Paramount. It's fucking not Friday the 13th. And this body swapping nonsense for Jason, and Jason's talking. He actually speaks in the film. I want to put, yeah, it's going to be C tier. It can't be B tier. It's going to go ahead of the Mouth of Madness. It's the worst Friday the 13th film, without doubt. But just when you think things couldn't get worse, we've got Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. This film is even worse than that. This is from 1991, and this is kind of like the death. In the same way Jason Goes to Hell is the death throes of the Friday franchise, this is the death throes of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, because this is the last sort of proper Nightmare on Elm Street film. After that, we get into sort of soft reboots, remakes, you know, you name it. It's just crazy. This is even worse than The Dark Half. This is D tier. Oh, Jess is in the chat. Hi, Jess. Nice to see you on board. Yeah, so yeah, that is just D tier. That is just one of the worst. Why have I got two? Oh, I know what I've done. It's okay. Yeah, the cover to New Nightmare and Freddy's Dead look identical almost to each other. And I almost made the mistake of putting New Nightmare in D tier. So the New Nightmare, obviously, is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This was Wes Craven's attempt at really relaunching the slasher genre. And this didn't quite work out. But it was a bloody good attempt. And this should have been a bigger hit. This is basically, I think this is why he made Scream. I think he wanted this to really, you know, become a big thing. And I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm thinking this wasn't a massive box office smash. I think sure it may have made a bit of money, but not much. But it was very, very meta, and I think that influenced him to go on and make Scream. And this is a really solid film. You know, you got Heaven Langenkamp coming back in real life, Robert Englund in real life. It's a really interesting take, and I think this is the take that Scream 5 should take with when it comes out in 2022. They're not going to do that by the looks of it, but this is absolutely the route they should take and end the franchise once and for all. But this is definitely, I think this is going to have to be A tier. It's not as good as Silence of the Lambs, but it's definitely definitely A tier there. People saying. Yeah, New Night came out the same time as Pulp Fiction. Yeah, you're probably right there, Sean. Why is my battery running low? Sorry, guys. Battery's running low. Yeah, I think the problem with New Nightmare was 1994 was not a good year to be releasing. Any time in the early 90s was just a bad time to be releasing horror films. It was. I don't know how old. I mean, Jess, I think you're like sort of like similar to me. Sean, I don't know how old you are, Sean, but you know, a lot of the people in our circles, like we kind of remember the early 90s to the mid 90s as just an absolute there was nothing going on, absolutely nothing going on. It wasn't until Scream came out that the floodgates opened, and you only need to look at it. I mean, as I say, just go on Wikipedia and type in horror movies, and it gives you a breakdown of like Western horror films from 1990 onwards. And there's just nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing of any interest. It's they're all, at best 6 out of 10 films, and obviously a lot of these films are from memory, but I did have to obviously do a bit of research, and a lot of these films are just like it's the same old films on every single website for the best films of the decade. And you think, if I'd done it for the 80s, I would have probably had to go through, 30 or 40 websites. I got all this from like about 4 websites. It's very, very similar films. Back to the list though. The Faculty from 1998, and again, look at the cover art of The Faculty. How much of an influence was Scream? I've not got to Scream yet, but how much of an influence was Scream on the horror genre in the late 90s? I mean, every single slasher film that came out after Scream had exactly the same, cover. It was like the faces of every character looking directly at the camera. And The Faculty is a really solid sort of like sci-fi slasher film. Robert Patrick great as the sports teacher. You've got oh my god, H2O guy. What's his name? The name escapes me. We've got Elijah Wood as well. Who's the guy from H2O who's in 30 Days a Night? Josh Hartnett. Yeah, so I think this might have been their debut feature. The pair of them, very young in this film, and it's a really, really solid, sci-fi sort of slasher. I really enjoyed it. It's probably not 8. I'd go B tier with this. It's probably I'd put it ahead of 7, which I know people won't probably like, but I'm not a massive 7 guy. I don't like these serious films. Now, Halloween 6: The Curse of Michael Myers from 1995. Yeah, this is a divisive movie in the franchise. A lot of people like this film, and a lot of people don't like this film. This is like the culmination of the Thorn trilogy. Now, if you don't like the Thorn trilogy, then you're probably not going to be on board with this film. It's also got like a pretty shitty mask. It's also Donald Pleasance's last performance, which I kind of think it gives it a bit more of a. It resonates more because it is Donald Pleasance's. It's not just his final performance in a Halloween film. I think this was his. I think he died like a year later after this film was made. So it does kind of give it that sort of like, resonance of like, it definitely, there is a bit of a morbid sensibility to it. But, I can't let that, overlook the fact that I'm not a massive fan of this film. For me, it's better than 5, clearly, but it's definitely not as good as 4, 3, 2, or 1. So I'd have to put this in the B tier. Probably, I'd have to put it ahead of 7 because I do love Halloween. So, and next up is Cube. Now, since people such as saying, Jess Lusky says in most of these movies, the Short Legends is on the list. Urban Legends is on the list, Jess. Sorry, Timmy, I enjoyed Ski more than Scream. Oh, I don't know about that. Maybe, I don't know. That's controversial. But next up is Cube. Now, Cube is like kind of like the escape room before the escape room became popular. Now, there's a lot of escape room movies now. I mean, I've seen The Escape Room, I think, from about 3 or 4 years ago. But there's a lot of like these cheap knockoffs of the same sort of, idea of like this escape room. They probably become even more popular post-COVID. But this is the original escape room, and this came out in 1987. And you're never going to top this as an homage to an escape. This is like escape room before they even became a thing. Cube is an absolutely incredible film. If you've not seen Cube, just watch it. This is such a good. I've not seen the sequels, but I don't really think you need to. I think just watching the first one is enough. If you it's such. I don't really want to spoil it, but it's definitely A tier. And I'd put it behind Blair Witch, but ahead of Silence of the Lambs. It's a great film. I'm sure you guys in the chat have seen Cube. It's such a great film. Next up is The People Under the Stairs. Now, this is a Wes Craven film. Wes Craven was really on a roll at this point. Wes Craven, he's kind of known for like Last House on the Left, Hills of Eyes in the 70s, and then doing Nightmare on Elm Street. But what gets overlooked is like, in the space of 5 years, he did Shocker in '89, which is a fucking great film. He did People Under the Stairs in '91, and then did New Nightmare in '94. 3 really, really solid films. And then obviously 2 years later, when done Scream, I'd argue that this is like Craven's John Carpenter period almost. He was just knocking. Shocker should have been a massive, massive, massive success. It never did take off because I think is coming in '89, the tail end of the slasher genre. It was probably the worst time to release a slasher film. But Shocker, People Under the Stairs, New Nightmare, and Scream, 4 films in 7 years. That's a hell of a run he was on there, and on par with, or not quite on par with Carpenter, but he did. But my God, really, really impressive run of films, and this is probably not A tier, but it's definitely B tier, and I've definitely put it ahead of Alien 3. This is a really, really enjoyable film. The kid from the hood ends up in this twisted psycho brother and sister crazy house, and he dresses up in a gimp suit, and there's all these people living in the cellar. It's just a really, really fun film. Yeah, you're right, Jess. It doesn't get enough love. Next up, It from 1990. Now, whatever your feelings on the remake, It's Chapter 1 from 2017, was it? Great film. Part 2 is complete dog shit, in my opinion. I don't like that film at all. It's just jump scare after jump scare. It doesn't do anything for me. It's the TV movie from 1990, which I always thought was just a film because I saw it as a kid, rented out from the video store, and just as a 3-hour film. I just thought it was a film, and that's why I class it as a film. But yeah, maybe because I saw this as I say, this film came out in 1990. I was 14, 13, going on 14, and the kids in the film are 13. So it kind of resonates with me, the whole time period. And I love that sort of the film's set in the late 50s in a small town in Maine, and I love that setting. And so even though it's probably not the best, the acting is certainly, certain characters are not on the. It's a bit ropey. It's definitely for me. It's definitely A tier. I do love this film. It's probably going to go ahead of Cube. Ahead of Cube, but behind Blair Witch. Only reason it's going behind Blair Witch is because I think Blair Witch is such an important film, and I did go and see a couple of times on the cinema. It still holds up. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Timmy. Part 2 was garbage. It really was. Next up, Audition. Now, Audition is, along with Ringu, is kind of like it was like the beginning of the J horror influence in America. I don't think it really hit America until maybe the beginnings of the 21st century. But Audition and Ringu were kind of like they were like the two sort of they like sort of blew the door open. And Audition certainly. There's a couple of scenes in that film. Obviously, we know that there's a scene with someone in a bag and the phone rings. That is just such a great move, such a great moment. And I think an American version of that would have ruined it. They probably would have made it clear earlier on in the movie that this person was a bit messed up, but they drag it out and they keep it going, and then you're thinking this is just a normal. You think there's maybe something off about her, but you don't think she's that off. And obviously, when you get to like the torture scene at the end, when you get the wire out, yeah, it's pretty intense. But it's for all that, I'm not a massive fan of it. I do like the certain scenes I really love, but I don't think it's as good as Ringu. It's definitely B tier, but I would put it further down, probably behind Misery, but ahead of Sleepy Hollow. Next up is Urban Legend. Who mentioned Eminem? Was that Sean or was it Timmy? Or I can't remember. Yeah. Urban Legend is a film from 1998. Now, I do love this film, and now this film isn't by no means perfect. Oh, by the way, look at the cover. Face is staring out at you again. The Scream influence is just massive. It's Jared Leto. I'm not sure if this is Jared Leto's. Is this Jared Leto's first movie? Chat. I'm not sure. I know he did My So-Called Life that which was a TV show. That's where I first saw him. But I don't know, is this his first film? A really solid cast. You got Joshua Jackson from Dawson's Creek. This is like just such a late 90s film. It really is. You look at the cast in this film. It's like, is Michelle Williams in this film as well from Dawson's Creek? I can't remember. Chat help me out again. Because Tara Reid, you've got Robert Englund in this film. I mean, how great is that? You've got Jared Leto. You've got an amazing cast. You've got Brad Dourif in the opening scene. It's just such a, and then, yeah, the killer's a bit of a letdown. You know, it's not a spoiler. You've got some girl who's like 5'1". How is she going to kill anyone? She's tiny. But it's late 90s. It was part of that glorious renaissance of slasher films in the wake of Scream. You know, you got Scream, Scream 2. I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend. In fact, it was just a great. There was like 96 to 99 was such a great time to be a slasher fan, especially if you were like sort of my age and you kind of thought it would just ended. But so it doesn't deserve A tier, but it's going A tier because it's got to be. It's going to be ahead of Silence of the Lambs, but behind Cube. Next up, well, it's Scream. This is S tier. I'm going to straight to number one. I'm just going to explain why. So, anybody who was a horror fan anyone grew up in the 80s into the 90s as a teenager, and it got, early 90s, there was cinema. You might have got like a few VHS releases, go to Blockbuster, there'd be some like cheap ass horror film going straight to video. But in terms of cinema releases, there was nothing. There was nothing going on. It was all very, very serious, psychological stuff like Seven, all stuff that takes itself too seriously. We wanted fun slasher movies, and we never got. We were waiting and waiting. New Nightmare came along in '94. That should have kicked the door down. It didn't. But Wes Craven went back to the drawing board, and he came back with Scream, and the rest is history. Now, I don't think I've made the case for Scream before, not in a video, but I've made it on, in terms of like message boards and stuff. I've said that, in my opinion, Scream is the most influential horror film of all time. I don't care what you say about Psycho or Halloween or Friday the 13th. My opinion is horror was completely dead in '96. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. That film came out, it rebirthed the slasher genre, which in turn, would Blair Witch Project have been made without the rebirth of the slasher genre? No, probably not. It would never have got a cinema release, which spawned the found footage genre, which spawned torture porn, which spawned everything going on. All leads back to Scream, and you can challenge me on it. I'll fight the case. I will say that Scream is the most influential in terms of like movies that it spawned than any other horror film ever made. And for me, it's not only that, it's a fantastic film, and that's why it's S tier for me, without doubt. Straight on to Scream 2. Such was the strength of that film that within 12 months they put the sequel out, which says something about the producers, the writers, the company. I think it was Miramax. The fact that they obviously gave them the money straight away, said get the sequel out as quickly as possible. So within 12 months, Scream 2 is released, and I love Scream 2. It's not as good as the original, but I think it's just a really, really solid, and I love college slashers. Scream 1 was obviously partly a college slasher, partly a, suburban slasher. Scream 2 is much more just college based, and for me, slasher films, it's camp slasher, it's college slasher, suburban slasher. They're like, and obviously college slasher and suburban slasher kind of like merge into one, but I think Scream 2 is a great film, and I think most people who are Scream fans, they tend to have, the franchise tends to fall in the same category. You know, most people go 1, 2, 4, 3, which is what I go. Some people say 1, 4, 2, 3, but it's usually a variation of them too. It's very few people put 3 anything other than bottom, and very few people put 1 anything other than number 1, because it is. I think it is quite sort of set in stone, which you know where it falls. But Scream 2 is definitely a category. I'd probably put it ahead of it, behind Blair Witch Project. Now next up is Halloween H2O. Now obviously this was rebooting, kind of like a soft reboot to the first 2 films. There's so many different timelines to Halloween, it's impossible to keep up. So this was a direct sequel to 2. 3 never happened. Well, 3 was in its own universe anyway. 4, 5, 6 never happened. This is Josh Hartnett. I think he's making his debut. Jamie Lee Curtis comes back. Michael's got about 4 different masks, which are all crap. It's very of its time, and I love the late 90s in terms of, I love Scream, I love Urban Legend, and I know it did last summer, but I love those films of that time because they are new to that time. Was Halloween H2O, because it's kind of connected to that old, like late 70s, early 80s aesthetic. I can't really warm to it. It feels like it's trying too hard to be like these new kids on the block, instead of maybe going back to like what the first 2 Halloween films were. You know what I mean? It feels like it's just copying the new kids to try and be popular, and I think that goes against it in some ways. I mean, I'm not sure how well it performed at the box office. Obviously got a sequel in Resurrection, which is obviously not going to talk about that, but it does feel like it's kind of, it feels like it's a bit late to the party. Scream, and I know we did last summer, got there first, and it feels like it should maybe it should be aimed more towards, a traditional Halloween film, rather than going for like the new kids on the block. For me, it's B tier. I'd probably put it definitely ahead of Alien, behind Ringu, but ahead of the Faculty. I do like the Faculty, but I'd probably put it ahead of the Faculty. Next up is Child's Play. No, I don't think it was a great ending. It was, and it should have ended like that. Sean shouldn't have carried on. That was just a load of nonsense. I mean, I refuse to recognize Resurrection. For me, it ended with H2O and then starts again with 2018. But yeah, Child's Play 2, sorry, because Child's Play 1 was 88. Child's Play 2, a lot of people like this more than the original. I actually don't think this is as good as the first film. And the reason for that is because I think it's, with the first film, the introduction of Brad Dourif as Chucky, and, getting to know him in the doll, and, you're not quite sure how it's going to go. And the scene where she checks the back and there's no batteries, and then he runs off, you can't really top that in the sequel, because you know what he is. And, I think it's hard, even though it's, maybe technically, in some ways is a more solar film, but I just think that you lack that sort of surprise elements you get with the original. It's because it's, with the sequel, you know what you're getting, and it is more of the same, and it's not like a massive improvement in terms of like storyline. So I don't really see how you can place the sequel ahead of the original. For me, it's definitely B tier, but it's probably going to go behind Misery and ahead of Audition. Behind Audition, ahead of Sleepy Hollow. Now, next up, and the point of view shot in the first are excellently. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it definitely. I do think, and as for the remake, I think I made a point in this in the last video. With the remake, you can't. The idea of an AI robot or AI doll, it's never going to be as creepy as a possessed doll, possessed by a serial killer. You just can't top that, can you? You know what I mean? I understand why they went that route because everything now is like got Alexa and smartphones, so it made sense to go that route. But it's let's face it, you're never going to be as freaked out by an AI doll as you are by a doll possessed by a serial killer, are you? Let's face it. But on to Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Now, I only saw this film for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and this is a really surprisingly good film. Now, I wasn't a fan of the second one with Dennis Hopper. I think that film is quite overrated. A lot of people love that film. For me, it's not a great film. Now, I've not seen The New Generation with Matthew McConaughey. I have no intention of watching that. But for me, without watching that one and completely erasing that from, history, in terms of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, for me, this comes behind the original and the remake. I think it's ahead of the prequel remake from 2006. I think it's ahead of Texas Chainsaw 3D and Leatherface. I think this is actually a really solid Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. It's obviously not going to be A tier, but I'd definitely put a B tier. Probably, yeah, I'd probably have to put it ahead of Child's Play 2. Now, what are we up to now? There's always films which I can't work out what I've uploaded, but I do know. This is a film called Happy Hell Night from 1992. Now, this is a film I haven't seen for years now. I don't know if anyone's actually seen this film. It came out during the dark times of the early 90s, but it's actually a really fun slasher film. It feels like an 80s film, but it's not. It's some incarcerated killer who's, I can't remember if he's released by accident but he goes on a killing spree. It's pretty unoriginal, and it feels very 80s, even though it's set in the 90s. But yeah, it's BT. It's probably behind Sleepy Hollow. Next up, Mimic from I think it says 1997. This is, I think, Mira Sorvino. This is about they're kind of like moth. It's like a giant moth, which mimics humans and then goes around. I don't remember much about this film, to be honest. That's like the 90s were a pretty poor time for horror, and I was kind of clutching at straws for some films, and I was looking at stuff that I haven't seen for a long, long time. But I do remember this being a fairly interesting film. The one thing about Mimic I do remember is that they do actually kill a couple of kids in the film, the actual killer. But I suppose with it being like semi-human, you can get away with that. And I think it starts like a 15 certificate at the time. But it's not a particularly great film that I remember, but it's definitely better than In the Mouth of Madness. But probably just behind Jason Goes to Hell. And Exorcist 3 is, this is arguably one of the greatest films of the 1990s in terms of horror. This is, a lot of people would argue this is better than the original Exorcist. I mean, I think it's certainly can make a case for it. It's got the greatest jump scare in the history of horror, I think. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, in the psychiatric hospital, if there's a better jump scare in any horror film, certainly the 1990s or any time, I haven't seen it. It really does. And that god awful Black Christmas remake from 2019 tried to copy it, and there's the definition of a bad director in terms of a good director. It was they tried to do a chop for shot and it didn't work because you just cannot copy that sort of like gene. The directing in that was just so good. And apparently there's a cut of Exorcist 3 which has never been released, which a lot of people want to try and get released a bit. It's almost like Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, which a lot of people are saying it's even better than this version. But whether that will ever happen, it'll probably never see the light of day. But Exorcist 3 is, for me, is definitely A tier. Probably I wouldn't put it ahead of Blair Witch. Behind Scream 2, yes, probably. But ahead of it, yes. Yeah, Exorcist 3 is fantastic, Sean. It is. I didn't know that about Mimic. I say I'm not. I wasn't a massive fan of Mimic. I just think it was. If it hadn't come out in the late 90s, I probably wouldn't even know that film existed. But because there was such a shortage of decent horror at that time, I think I just made myself watch that. Return of the Living Dead 3. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Return of the Living Dead franchise. I know some people love the franchise. I think Return of the Living Dead, at least part one, is one of the most overrated horror films of all time. I think it's really, really average. And Return of the Living Dead 3 is worse than part one. I think 2 is probably the best of the franchise, but yeah, I'm not a fan of this movie. This would be D tier. Head of the Dark Half, though. Next up, I Know What You Did Last Summer. Now, this film isn't in the same league as Scream. I would argue that even Urban Legend is a better film, but because this film came out in '97, it's just got that. It's at that time where I just absolutely adore those sort of films. You know, they came out in the late '90s, and I love the cast: Sarah Michelle Gellar, Freddie Prinze Jr. Yeah, it's an interesting killer, although some would argue not. But I don't want to go I don't want to go A2 with this, but I can't help it because it's just that little period between '96 and '98 where those slasher films I just adored. So I'm gonna have to go. I think I prefer Urban Legend to those. So I'm gonna go. Yeah, I'm gonna put it behind Urban Legend. Next up is Wishmaster. Now, Wishmaster is a really, really fun. It's like it is a slasher film, but it's very much everybody's seen a Wishmaster. You know, if you've seen Wish, you know it's a bit like Wonder Woman '84. You know, it's like the monkey's paw. You get a wish, you get whatever you want in life, but obviously there's something negative to it, and this film is just plays on that. And this is a really, really solid film. I think this was '97 as well. But it definitely B tier. I couldn't go A tier for this. It's probably it's had Sleepy Hollow, but behind Child's Play 2. Next up, I still know what we did last summer. Now, I've been a long time since I've seen this film. This came out within 12 months of the previous film. A bit like Scream, they were really knocking these films out at a quick pace. They knew they were onto something. They knew they were onto like making money. And this suffered badly, I think, from being rushed. I mean, where Scream 2 I think, was a really, really solid entry into the Scream franchise. I think they really rushed this. I don't think it paid off. This is not a great film, in my opinion, by any stretch of the imagination. I think this would have to be like even C tier. It's better than Jason Goes to Hell, but it's definitely C tier. Next up, House on Haunted Hill from 1989. Now, this is a really, really solid haunted house flick. It's a remake of the '59 film, which starred Vincent Price. This stars Jeffrey Rush and Famke Janssen. Offered like $1 million to stay in a so-called haunted house overnight, and obviously things go south pretty quickly. This has got some really, really creepy imagery in it. Really, really creepy imagery. It's a really, really solid film at the time. It's got some like early sort of. I think it's got some early CGI, which doesn't look too bad. I think it was CGI at the time, but it's held up quite well, and I actually really, really think this is such a solid film. I'd definitely play this. Maybe even I wouldn't go A tier, but I'd definitely go B tier. I'd probably put this ahead of. I'd actually put this ahead of The Faculty. Probably would put it ahead of H2O, even though H2O wasn't a Halloween film. And next up, we've got The Relic from 1987 with Tom Sizemore. This is like a monster movie, basically. I think it's the Chicago Museum. Tom Sizemore spends the night, and there's a female lead as well. I don't remember much about this film. Every time I watch this film, I fall asleep. Now, I do like the film, but for some reason, every time I've seen this film, I've always been like really tired and like ended up nodding off and like having to rewatch it. But I do like the film. I think it's quite a solid film. But it's definitely of its time. It is a good creature feature. I will give it that. But Tom Sizemore does overact a little bit in it. I think he was doing a lot of cocaine at the time. It would definitely be B tier though. I'd probably can't put it ahead of Audition, but I'd probably just put it be ahead of Child Play 2. But no, behind Leatherface. No, behind Leatherface. Doesn't want to work. Doesn't want to do that for some reason. There we go. Next up, Vampires. Now, Vampires is a John Carpenter film. I think James Woods overacts to a ridiculous degree. I don't like James Woods in this film. I don't like this film. Some people do. I think this is just so over the top. James Woods, he gives me a migraine in this film. He's so loud and obnoxious, so annoying. You're rooting for the vampires. You're just rooting for the bad guys in this film. I don't like James Woods in this film. It's so annoying. I'm not saying it's a bad film, but he just ruins it for me. And I'd have to put this C tier behind In the Mouth of Madness. And if I could remember those two films, I'd use them, but I can't remember what they are. So I'd say last but not least, Candyman from 1992. Candyman is very much an urban slasher. It's not really my kind of thing. It's very rare to see like an urban slasher. Most slasher films are like camp slasher, suburban slasher, collar slasher. This is like set in the projects of Chicago, the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago, which have been demolished. Which I know during filming were like some of the most dangerous places in the whole of America, and you can tell because it looks really, really bad. But it's a really unusual setting for a slasher film. But obviously, because the Candyman, I don't know if it's based on a real urban legend in Chicago or some other like American city. But yeah, I like the film, but as I say, the setting does put me off. I'm not a big fan of that like ultra urban setting. For me, slasher films is like they are like college settings or like tree-lined streets. It's like this gritty tower block, like in downtown Chicago. It's not really my thing. Do you know what I mean? But I actually do appreciate what it did. But I just couldn't go above B tier for this. It would have to be probably be ahead of Sleepy Hollow, but probably would be behind Child's Play 2. Although Child's Play 2 is quite an urban slasher film as well. Love the score, Sean. Yeah, it does have a good score. I haven't really got too much hope for the sequel, the remake, sorry, but yeah, I wish I could remember those two films I've uploaded the images for, which I can't remember, but that is basically, that is my definitive, I say definitive. Obviously there are films missing, but as much as I can remember about the 90s, this is kind of like what I go by. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this, guys. Next week, I am just planning on just doing a live stream, and I'm going to put a link in the description. I'm just hoping some people will just jump on and join. But for now, yeah, I think I'm just going to call it a night because I am tired. I do want to go to bed. But thanks for the chat, Sean, Timmy, Jess. Really appreciate you turning up, guys. Really means a lot. Thanks a lot. Anyway, I will see you guys later. and I will end the stream now when I work out what I'm doing. Yeah. Cheers, guys. See you later.